Welcome to Better Teaching, Only Stuff That Works, a podcast for teachers, instructional coaches, administrators, and anyone else who supports teachers in the classroom. This show is a proud member of the BE Podcast Network, shows that help you go beyond education. Find all our shows at bepodcastnetwork.com. I am Gene Tavernetti, the host for this podcast, and my goal for this episode, like all episodes, is that you laugh at least once and that you leave with an actionable idea for better teaching. A quick reminder, no cliches, no buzzwords, only stuff that works. I am so excited about my guest today because we have an opportunity to chat and learn a lot about supporting secondary students who are struggling with becoming proficient in all areas of literacy. So my guest this morning is Faith Howard. Faith is a passionate secondary literacy specialist for Sublette County School District number 1 in Pinedale, Wyoming. With 16 years of experience in education, Faith has taught middle and high school ELA in 3 different states, as well as coached English and social studies teachers as a director of curriculum and instruction. For the past 3 years, Faith has served as a literacy specialist where she created Literacy Lab, an innovative 612 literacy intervention model that incorporates the structured literacy and the science of reading to address gaps with foundational reading skills in a teen-friendly format. She is a graduate of William Jewell College with a dual bachelor's degree in secondary education and English, and the University of Wyoming in 2021 with a master's degree in curriculum and instruction. Faith is a national board certified teacher and a current Goyan Literacy Foundation Fellow and a board member of the Reading League of Wyoming. One of Faith's greatest passions is working with underserved students, those who have been overlooked or left behind due to unsuccessful literacy attempts. Faith is dedicated to helping struggling adolescent readers succeed, bringing hope and tangible solutions to challenges that many educators face. She thrives on collaborating with teachers who are ready to innovate and push boundaries to support literacy growth at the secondary level. Beyond her work in education, Faith is a dedicated wife, mother of 2, an active community member. Originally from Kansas City, Missouri, she enjoys spending time outdoors with her family, playing competitive volleyball, and coaching middle and high school volleyball and basketball. I think you're really going to enjoy this one and learn a lot about secondary literacy. Good morning, Faith. Welcome to Better Teaching, Only Stuff That Works.
Hi, glad to be here.
Well, boy, I'm excited. I'm excited that you're here, and I'm excited to have you in particular and excited about the topic because I know all over the country now, even legislators are getting involved with the science of reading and making sure that reading instruction is becoming more uniform and uniform in a manner that in which more kids can learn. But unfortunately, even if that is perfect, we still have a generation of kids in school now who may not be reading as well as we would like them to be. And somehow many times they say falling through the cracks. But you've actually developed a program, and you call it your lab, your reading lab. Is that what you call it?
Yeah, Literacy Lab.
Literacy Lab. Could you tell us a little bit about that, the Literacy Lab?
Yeah, Literacy Lab was really born out of, I always say this, out of desperation. I am a former high school English teacher who always had students who struggled to access grade level content. And I had a really hard time knowing, besides differentiating instruction, how to support them to solve those issues if they had these underlying gaps. But as you know, most secondary teachers, even English teachers, are not formally taught how to teach kids how to read because the assumption is that they already know how to read by the time they reach middle and high school. So then they're reading to learn, not learning to read. That phrase is used a lot in education. And so I stepped into 4 years ago a literacy specialist role for my school district, and mostly out of passion for wanting to figure out a way to support those lower kids, and negotiated the ability to have an elective class period in their school day in addition to their high school English class, where we could support their growth in fundamental, right, foundational reading skills. But then there became this big question of, well, how do you do that? There really were no existing curriculums or materials or programs designed for older struggling readers. Everything is designed for elementary students. So I started doing a lot of research, a lot of reading books, attending conferences and webinars, and basically from that created this idea of literacy lab where we take the core components of the science of reading and then integrate those into a novel study so that it feels relevant and appropriate for older readers. But in a sneaky way, it's interventions that are masked in what looks like an English class to the unknown eye, untrained eye, but with significant intention around addressing gaps in foundational reading skills. So those key components are working on oral reading fluency, decoding and encoding words, so sounding out multisyllabic words in reading and then being able to spell those words as well. Then breaking down higher level vocabulary through morphology instruction, and then teaching explicit reading comprehension strategies, and then last pairing writing based on what they're reading about. And so all of that is taught using structured literacy approaches in Lit Lab. So things like modeling, giving processes and steps, I do, we do, you do, from Treats Like a Champion, systematic work through a text. So really breaking down a text and talking about its meaning, and then doing lots of verbal processing and academic discussions. And so, this has been a labor of love. And when I first started in this role, I really didn't know what I was doing. And a lot of it's been trial and error, and then stealing little bits and pieces from elementary teachers and evidence-based approaches that are proven that work with younger readers, but then having to transform those to figure out what does this actually look like? What could this look like in a high school classroom or in a middle school classroom for students that are reading significantly behind where they're supposed to be?
Okay,
And it's been really rewarding. Yeah.
it's so let's go back to the very beginning of as you were talking about this lab, because you were already in a role to support readers, right? Or
Mhm.
you were already in that role and you had to negotiate. I think that's the word you said. You had to negotiate to try this other thing. So what were you doing before in your
Mhm.
support that wasn't working that made you decide? And the reason that I say that is so many times, we hear about something, like I could have listened to your description and you say, oh, I do that.
Mhm.
Well, no, you don't. So I'm sure that those were the things maybe you wanted to do, but let's talk about
Yeah.
the role that you were in, which might have been what many see as a more traditional type of support. What were you doing before you did the lab that made you realize, man, this isn't impacting the way I wish it would?
Yeah, in the very first semester as a literacy specialist, what we had envisioned, or what we had kind of initially established in my district was I would run an academic support class, and they had kind of clued in on a list of students who tested lower on our state standardized tests in reading, and they assigned them to me. And then they were meant to work on homework and assignments in school, and I was going to support them and kind of tutor them specifically on assignments that involve reading and writing. So it was like their social studies homework, they're reading a seminal document and answering some comprehension questions. Or for their English class, they're writing an essay and I'm supposed to help them edit and revise their paper. And, you know, was that approach helpful in getting their grades up a little bit and helping them pass classes? Yes. However, I realized very quickly on that this like tutoring model was a band-aid over a bullet hole. We were supporting them to be able to pass classes, but at the end of the day, if they're still functionally illiterate or they don't have the foundational skills that they need, then we're not addressing the root cause of why their grades are struggling and why they test lower on our state tests for ELA in the first place. And so from that, there was this moment where I was sitting with a student and I'm like, okay, I want you to read back your essay to me. I want you to read this out loud to me. And he's reading it out loud and it's choppy, it's broken, it's incredibly painful and slow. There's no expression, it's like monotone. And half of the words in there that he had, tried to Google words to make it sound better, he could not actually sound them out correctly. They were multisyllabic words, which is really common in secondary level texts and in writing. You're expected to, be using higher level vocabulary. And I think a light bulb clicked for me where I was like, I'm not actually helping them if I can't help him to read better than what he's doing right now, to sound these words out, to be able to spell these words correctly. Then, like, me helping him to pass his sophomore English class is not, that's not gonna create some kind of meaningful tr change for this student and for their future. And so that was the moment where, I went to our curriculum director and I said, we've got to re-envision what this looks like, and I need more training in order to do that. And so, yeah, it started. I took an IMSI Morphology Plus course, and then I started learning about the science of reading. And that's really when I said, okay, I want to isolate. The next semester, I started doing small group pullout from students in other classes and doing interventions with just doing morphology lessons. And we immediately saw growth. And with the morphology, you do fluency. And so students are reading out loud passages. So it was like a little bit of a taste, right? Just like a small kind of preview of what it could be. And then I was like, okay, I'm pulling them out 2 or 3 times a week for 20 minutes, but I need more time. They need more time because I can't just teach them morphemes and be doing some fluency work. They need these other parts. I'm looking at the science of reading and I'm like, okay, so we're working a little bit on fluency, we're working on morphology, but I'm not able to explicitly teach comprehension strategies to increase their understanding of what they're reading. And I'm really not able to dive in with the lowest students in phonics rules that they either did not learn or that they have not retained over years. And so, letter sound correspondences that they're just completely missing when they're reading words or trying to spell words. And so, really, from that, I was like, if I can have dedicated time, I could create a curriculum from scratch where I build in each of these pieces. And so, once we got approval to do that and we qualified students using data to put them in this class, then it became okay. So I was using these different pieces and pulling from different places. And then I said, I'm a former English teacher. I'm used to teaching books and novels. Why couldn't I teach books and novels to these students, even though they're struggling readers? I think I can engage them in books and high school level books, not little kid books.
Yeah.
And so then that's really when in year 2, when I came up with this integrated model where I said, we're going to read a novel like Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson or The Other Wes Moore by Wes Moore. And while we are reading it, I'm going to hit all of those foundational pieces through a structure and routine each day that hits each of the pieces of the science of reading.
Okay, okay.
And
I got
so,
questions.
yeah.
I got questions, Faith. Sorry to interrupt, but I've got questions. So let's go back to the original model that you had that you were pulling students. Who are you pulling? When were you pulling them? Were you pulling them out of an ELA class? Were you pulling them they're out of random classes to create a homogeneous group? What did that look like? And the reason, and again, we need examples and non-examples because there may be people listening who have programs who are doing it similar to the way that did it work. So if you could
Yeah.
describe the original programs, how did you do that? How did you identify those students?
Yeah, I mean, originally, the students that we started doing the pullout with were already rostered into an academic support class. So they had time for study hall dedicated. And these are typically students that have IEPs or 504 plans who have been flagged, right? Or it's in their IEP goals where they have reading challenges. And so those were like the easy, that was like the first pass was like, oh, yeah, these students need special services. It's already written into a plan for them and they have a dedicated time in their day. So we're just going to pull them out of their academic support where they're working on homework and assignments anyway. And we're going to forfeit some of that time to work on these reading skills, these literacy skills. But I'll say, right, you're asking for like the real truth here. And those are students, yes, they needed small group instruction and they needed that support. But what about all of the other kids who have been passed along who don't have a dedicated time in the day or it's not written into they don't have an IEP or a 504, but they are certifiably struggling in reading and significantly behind where they're supposed to be. And so that's really when it was like, we need a universal screener that we can give 3 times a year at our school so that I can catch the students who don't have something in their day. And that is, to me, has been the greatest value add. And when you look at my school district and our high school's reading data over the last 3 years, we have had incredible growth and gains. And one of the biggest attributes of that, one of the reasons why, is because we weren't just targeting students on IEPs who already maybe were receiving special services. We were targeting students who had kind of been passed along or forgotten about. And so that's what I really love about this literacy lab model is we're looking for students who are, you know, have those gaps, but that if this didn't exist, they would just be struggling and floating along, and that would never get addressed. And I think that is typically what happens when students are in middle and high school. If they're exited from Title I reading, or they were receiving interventions in elementary and they might have met the exit criteria. This is what's fascinating about all of this. There's new research and some commentary out there that talks about this idea of students might do okay and kind of reach that threshold for fluent reading and kind of seeming like they're doing okay in elementary school. But what happens when they bump up to middle and high school and the texts that they're being exposed to are significantly more complex in their syntax, in their sentence structure, in the vocabulary, in the amount of multisyllabic words, that even students who were maybe right on the fringe and okay in elementary school and kind of got there per se, then we see a drop off. And that's consistent with NAEP data too. And so, researching this idea of like what happens if a student has been caught up through interventions in elementary school and at the end of fifth grade they seem like they're, or even end of third grade, they seem like they're kind of right at grade level, and then fast forward and we look at them in sixth or eighth grade and there's like a significant drop off and now they're below grade level again. And so for me, that's been like a part of this process is finding those kids and saying, okay, yes, I know it's frustrating because you thought you had met the mark, but now the mark has been moved up significantly higher, but you stayed here. And so now we've got to kind of bring a new set of ammo to the table to help support you to get you there. So when we did that, those kids didn't have dedicated time in their day. So that's where the idea of this has to be a separate elective period because there is no other time in the school day to support that level of instruction if these are non-IEP students. There's just like nothing written into the schedule, and it can't be their English class because they still need that. This is something different.
Okay, so let's talk about you talked about a screener that is used. Okay, before we talk about, I want a little bit more detail about the screener, what it is, and then who does
Sure.
it. But it's interesting, when I work with ELA teachers, I remember doing a training once and we were talking about instruction, and a teacher said, "Well, that's fine, but my kids can't read." And it was interesting because the principal got up and said, "All your kids can read. They may not all be at grade level, but they can read." So there's a kind of a belief sometimes in the general ed. I worked recently at a secondary school and said, "Oh, well, I have to do it this way because my kids, it's a fourth grade level reading." So a couple questions, with that as context. Number one is if you didn't have a screener, because many schools do not have a screening process that you're going to describe in a moment, what might a profile of a kid who's not reading at grade level look to a teacher how does it manifest, I guess is what I'm trying to say. How would a teacher recognize that, this is a struggling reader that lacks some skills versus, I wish this kid would try.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the biggest tell is ask a student to read out loud to you and at a grade level text, and you can hear it almost immediately, right? But kind of a sad truth, I recently read an article about this where anymore in secondary spaces, students can float through their entire day and not really read out loud ever. They're not working on fluency. And so, even in English classes, right? Most reading is taxed onto students as independent after elementary school. And that's a really sad truth because I think if we had students reading out loud more, it would unmask a lot of the challenges because so what you're looking for when you're listening to a student read is everything from are they reading with expression? Is there any prosody, right? If their voice is robotic and lacking expression, it means that they're not understanding what it's actually saying or talking about. So there's a huge gap in comprehension because how we read out loud is how we read in our heads. And so if it's choppy and robotic and there's no expression, or if they're blowing through periods and commas, their brain cannot actually make sense of those ideas as separate functions, as separate sentences. So that's one of the clues. The other one is when you're listening to them read out loud, are they able to sound out and properly decode words with tricky spelling patterns, vowel teams, or multisyllabic words? And if they can't, that's another indicator of skills gaps. And you don't even need to purchase any kind of screening materials in order to do that. The Dibbles 8th edition has free online through the University of Oregon printable benchmark assessments to give beginning, middle, and end of year. And it's really fast. You time a student reading aloud for 1 minute. And even for high schoolers, it only goes up through eighth grade level because the theory is that your fluency once you're at a high school level, end of eighth grade level, your fluency is not going to drastically, reading faster isn't going to have a huge value add once you've met that benchmark. And so even with high school students, we still can use that eighth grade level benchmarking materials. And then they have progress monitoring materials. All of it's printable and free online. So it's really wonderful. So I would say if a school doesn't have the ability to purchase anything, then start there. And even for regular classroom teachers, listen to them, have them read out loud, and you're going to hear it right away. If it's really labored and super slow, it means that all of their cognitive load is focusing on just the actual reading words fluently or reading words, decoding them. So then there's no space left in their brain to be thinking about the meaning of the text. And then the other places to look are a lot of these students that struggle with reading, it's actually undiagnosed dyslexia. So if you look at their writing and you're seeing them flipping B's and D's, that's one traditional, right, kind of signal or sign among many of dyslexia, but can be like a quick tell or a hint. But the beauty of this is that you don't need an official dyslexia diagnosis in order to provide high quality instruction that's going to support dyslexic students. The science of reading does that. And so, even just by incorporating these approaches, and tier 1 teachers in regular classrooms can utilize a lot of these strategies to support struggling readers. So, it doesn't just have to happen in intervention spaces, although I'll say that my biggest hope for schools is that I work with a lot of schools and teachers, kind of like helping support professionally, like helping schools to implement similar models to Literacy Lab. And the number one roadblock is finding time in the day. And so you have to get administrators on board and they have to be willing to say, yeah, we can add in an elective period. And maybe it's an elective, non-elective, meaning that some kids are going to be based on data, qualify and be put into this class because it's what's best for them. And that's really hard at the high school level where they're competing for graduation credits, but they're there for 4 years. And giving up one elective for 1 year is not going to derail them. It's actually going to accelerate their ability to be more successful in the future.
Okay, so before we get them into the lab, and I still want to get them there and know more about what you do specifically, but let's go back, restate something that you just mentioned with respect to restate it and give it more emphasis. And you tell me if I'm giving it the right emphasis. And that is that the kids, could go all day without needing to read out loud. So are you saying that teachers should have kids read out loud in secondary?
Yes, 100%.
Okay. Okay.
Yes.
All right.
And we're not
Okay.
and we're not talking popcorn reading. Okay. Popcorn reading has been really debunked as being an ineffective method. We don't want guided reading models, again, debunked through research. There's it's not really new, but it's catching a lot of traction around education channels called phase reading. And it's this idea of targeted feedback from a teacher. And so the teacher is controlling the reading and they're calling on students to read out loud as they're working through the passage. The teacher models fluent reading for students. That's also proven to be really effective. So for them to hear a teacher reading it aloud fluently, but then you start phasing in other students and they have no idea, right? It's intentional of which students you're calling on, but they have no idea at what point they're going to get called on. It's randomized to them. And so they have to be paying attention. So engagement's really high. But the beauty comes in the moment, real-time feedback that's being provided by the teacher around the expression that they're using. If they skip periods or commas, you're like, oh, let's go back. Actually, there was the end of an idea right there. So we need a pause. We need to stop there. And then helping them sound out those multisyllabic words or if they misread a word. And so those little doses like that are easy to incorporate even in, I think about in a science class or a social studies class at the secondary level, as well as English. And then a lot of partner reading. So, there are times where independent practice is really important, but are there other times where in a lesson, part of the reading could be broken out and say, okay, you're going to alternate paragraphs reading aloud with your partner, or you're going to alternate sentences reading aloud in small groups instead of reading in silence in a silo.
Talk about, and I'm really putting myself out here now based on some advice that I've been giving secondary teachers. How about choral reading?
Yeah, choral reading is another high impact approach. I think it's hard to do that for longer, larger stretches of text.
Yeah,
No,
right.
I
Yes.
I
Yeah. Yeah.
do yeah, I do choral reading in my lit lab. So when we do our weekly fluency, we have repeated reading routine. Each day they read the same passage and they're timing each other and giving feedback to their partner for a minute. And but before they read aloud to their partner, we do things like reciprocal reading, echo reading, and choral reading as a
Talk
class.
about talk about reciprocal. Could you give more a little bit more description of those things, how you do it effectively?
Yeah, yeah, reciprocal reading I really love. And again, you do it with a short dosage of text, talking like maybe 3 sentences max. And so the teacher reads the first word, the students chorally read the second word in the sentence, and so on. You literally are alternating words back and forth in the sentence. And it's working on eye tracking for students. It's also working on them being able to follow along. So they're hearing certain words being fluently read. They're having to then, right, think about the next word in the consecutive order. So you do that one time through. Then you track back, you do it a second time through where you're doing the alternating reading pattern. The teacher is able to hear the class and hear students, and you can do this one-on-one as well, but you hear, and if you hear any mispronunciations of a word when students are queued up for their word, you're immediately able to intervene and work on the pronunciation of that word and have them repeat it back before you move on. The third time you track back, and then it's a choral read with everyone out loud together. And so that's the one I do on day one of my fluency routine almost every single Monday because it offers them the most slowing down and really having to examine every single word in the sentence. And it also gives you that corrective feedback for them if they're mispronouncing or misreading words. And I even coach them on prosody there. So if they're
Yeah.
sounding really robotic and flat and we got to a comma, prosody says, okay, when you get to a comma in reading, it's a scoop. So your voice actually goes down, up, and then down, or up, down, up, if you think of it that way. And test that out, right? For people listening, next time you're listening or you're fluently reading, just think about what does your voice do when you get to a comma to acknowledge that this is like an additional idea that's going to come after the comma. And it's typically with that scoop. So we practice that as well.
So I think one of the most common things that I see when I see teachers try like a choral read is they break that rule that you just mentioned. Very short. It's going to be very short. We're not going to read many paragraphs, of chorally. We're just going to do a short passage, few sentences, and then we're able to do these strategies that you talk about because then within that short passage, you're able to do diagnosis, you're able to do feedback, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Too long, if it's too long, it just becomes, an unfocused practice. It is a naive type
Yeah.
of practice where you can't do anything. But I think you said And if you didn't say it, I imagine that you say it, and that was when you're doing this, even though it's a choral or many voices, you can still hear the students. You can still hear individual students. I mean, because one thing is you have an idea. I'm talking about the regular ed classrooms now, because you
Mhm.
have an idea who your higher readers are. I don't need to focus in on them. I'm focusing in on the other students to hear, and you even in a group, you can pick up individual voices.
Yeah. Yes. And especially if you're already aware of who those students might be, then your circulation path in the classroom, you're standing closest to some of those students and listening while they're doing the choral reading. And you're even watching their mouth, right? Looking at their lips to see what sounds are they forming. We have some mumblers who are excellent at kind of hiding their challenges, and they will skip words and they will mumble through words. And really, they've learned this compensation strategy of like avoiding difficult words in texts. And so, one of the key rules in my literacy lab, and that I tell teachers, to focus on is like every word gets read in here. Like, there are no words, even if you mispronounce a word and then I say it back to you. And I'm like, okay, now repeat that word back. It's not like I say the word for you and then you just keep reading on past that word in the passage. You actually need to be the one that says it. And then we're going to work through systematically how to pronounce that word through a decoding multisyllabic word strategy. But yeah, yeah, watching their mouths is huge too, because you can catch a lot of like, oh, wow, you really, you just kind of muddled through that word because you didn't know what sound it was supposed to make.
Yeah. Trust me, we're going to get to your literacy lab soon, but I still want to help support the general ed teachers
Oh, yeah.
so that they don't get there. So again, a point of emphasis was if you do this routine that you just mentioned, where the kids are reading aloud, it's for short periods of time,
Yeah.
and because that's one of the it's always a pushback, and it's a legitimate pushback. It says, I have to teach this content. And
Hmm.
so that's true, but these short bursts are still going to have a big impact for you. These strategies will work, not only the ones that we just talked about with respect to reading out loud, but the ones that are coming up when you talk about your strategies in the lab.
Well, and can I just add in tier one, I think like having been a high school English teacher before, the temptation is ever present where if a teacher's like, yeah, okay, we have something, we're going to read it out loud. Either the teacher reads it out loud, or what do we typically do? We say, okay, who would like to read? Raise your hand.
Yeah.
Who wants to read next? And then who are the kids that are raising their hands to read? Those are
Right.
your fluent on grade level readers who actually like don't need a lot of practice or as much support. The ones who are flies on the wall or who are going to disappear and ask to go to the bathroom and be gone for 15 minutes are the kids who are avoiding reading like the plague because they are masters at kind of hiding in the shadows, because it's, there's a lot of shame associated with an inability to read and kind of struggling in that way. And so they don't want to have to read out loud in front of their class. They're mortified of that, and rightfully so. But I think if we only ever call on the strongest students to read aloud to the class, then we're sort of not providing that support, or even just like as a tier one teacher, we're not even aware of where the gaps are or that some students struggle. So,
So this is something new, with something, that I hadn't talked about in advance that we were going to be talking about this, but I want your view on this. So we have students that don't read well. I'm thinking I'm a general ed teacher. I have students, oh, it's going to be difficult for these people to read this text. It's grade level text. And so one of the go-tos is, okay, instead of reading it, we're going to have them do an audio
mhm.
version of it. Thoughts about that? Pluses, minuses. Um, we're only on audio, but there was a little smile there when I asked you that. So
Yeah.
your
Yeah, because
opinions on that?
it is a really controversial topic, and I think there is some misunderstanding. It's like it's not an all or nothing. And so when teachers say, "Oh, they can't do audiobooks, that's terrible for them," I'm always like, I'm actually in disagreement of that. Now, if students only are ever listening to audio, right, then it's supporting their auditory comprehension, but it's actually not supporting their reading comprehension, especially if they're not having to look at the text. So one of the key things is if you're going to use audio, They need to be following along and visually looking at the words. There is a lot of research that says that hearing fluent reading is really valuable for students and helps to support their own ability to then read fluently. However, that theory drops off if you never have students reading fluently. Like if you only ever play audio for them and they're following along in the text, that's great. Their comprehension will be higher. So sometimes what I like to think of is what is the purpose of that reading activity? And depending on what your end goal is. So when I am either in a typical reading lesson, I also teach seventh grade English language arts right now in my current role. And so often for a reading lesson, I'll start with the audio for the I do because the focus is not on the fluent reading. I want them to comprehend the information so that then I can model a strategy around the standard that lesson focuses on. Okay, so recently we had a lesson on evaluating the reliability, whether the information in an informational text was reliable or unreliable. And so for that, I'm hitting that standard. So, yes, they need to understand what's happening in the text. And so, them being able to read through it, I deprioritized over me modeling that skill through Think Alouds. So we listen to the audio of it, then I stop and I go back through and I show them that of like how to analyze the information for reliability. Then we go into the we do, and that's when then they're reading aloud either through phase reading or through partner reading in small groups so that we're reinforcing fluency, but then they come back together to practice identifying and analyzing the reliability of the source. And then there's a check for understanding in there to see, okay, once they didn't hear fluent reading from audio or from a teacher, did that impact their comprehension? I need to make sure they actually understood the content of the reading. And then if they sort of pass that check for understanding and they're in a good place, then you release them to the you do. And that's when then they're going to read silently on their own. And by chunking the text like that, right? Then they're not having to read massive chunks of text completely by themselves, and they've been modeled a strategy for how to do it well. But every student that day had to read at least a paragraph out loud to another student. And so you're kind of hitting at their, at those reading skills while also still teaching your standards and content. So I'm a big proponent of mixing it up and using all of it. But I think for classroom teachers, especially in like general education, just to think about what's the purpose of this activity. And if it leans more heavily on a new standard or a new skill that you're teaching, then it's 100% okay to play audio or to have it fluently read by an adult instead of having students read. Then when you're having them practice that skill, couldn't their skills practice involve also reading aloud to one another? So yeah, it's a sort of a mixed approach.
Okay. So I think with that answer, I may be understanding now what's happening in your reading lab that was different from a regular ELA class. Because when you originally described your reading lab and you're talking, we're using novels as a vehicle, and we're doing this reading and we're teaching all of these literacy skills and we're practicing. I'm thinking, well, what's different? Well, based on your answer, maybe it's the use of informational text and literature in a regular class, but in your class, you're focusing on just the novels. Was that a correct inference on my part? Or
No,
okay,
actually, in
okay.
Literacy Lab, they do. So, our repeated reading, right? There's a big debate in education right now and in the reading world around what's more appropriate for students. And there's been some articles written about this of like the death of novels and books in secondary education. A deprioritization of reading whole texts over text sets and shorter articles. And it's kind of sad. It's unfortunate that's like what was misinterpreted. When you're teaching skills and strategies to students, I think then the temptation is like, let's do little bite-sized dosage of that. And so we move away from teaching whole texts. But in Literacy Lab, it's a marriage of both. And there's a book called Reading Reconsidered that talks about this idea of inside the bullseye and then outside the bullseye. And it's this idea of you have a primary text, which could be your novel, and then you're bringing in outside shorter text to support building background knowledge on that greater, larger text. So with Literacy Lab, but this honestly should be happening in tier one instruction as well. So this is where it's not that far removed. And that's what makes it more effective, I think, these interventions. But is like with Literacy Lab, they're reading a novel. So, for example, right now, my Literacy Lab at the high school is reading A Long Way Gone by Ishmael Bey, and it's about the Sierra Leonean Civil War. So it's narrative nonfiction. But then every week, their fluency article for their fluency routine that they're reading Monday through Thursday, since we're a 4-day school week this year, is an informational text that I pull and then use a free website to format into a repeated reading for where they're timing each other and they can see how many words are on each line for recording that. But I hand pull the articles at grade level, so high school level informational texts that are providing background information about the something that's going to come up in the reading in the chapters of the book that week. And so it could be anything from there's a recent chapter that we read where these boys were barefoot and they had to hike along a sandy beach and their feet got burned really badly and they had blisters and then the skin started like peeling off of their bottom of their feet. And it was this really horrible, right, situation that turned into a medical kind of nightmare for them. And so I wanted my students to read about thermal sunburns, specifically from sand, and the impact of that, and like the reality of what temperature the sand has to be at in order for that to happen, and then how to prevent it and how to take care of that. So sometimes it's things like that. And then other times it's information on how did the Sierra Leonean Civil War actually start? So by connecting it, that's what I'm talking about. I mentioned earlier of integrating, so they're getting both types of texts and they're practicing skills for both types of texts with comprehension strategies. So one that works really well for short informational texts is partner reading paragraph shrinking. And so they're annotating the text and summarizing the main idea of each paragraph in order to get a better idea about what that passage is talking about. But then they're applying that knowledge to the novel to have greater depth of understanding to the bigger text. And then some of the strategies that we've been using a lot in with the novel are things like brain dump, turn and talk, and then summarizing the gist. And that's a retrieval practice strategy that comes from this book called Powerful Teaching that is really wonderful and has a lot of practical strategies that teachers can use for helping students to recall and remember information that they just have read.
You know what? We're in your literacy lab now, but I can't help but go back to the general ed
Oh, go for
classroom.
it.
You know,
Yeah.
so again, I'm still trying to determine what's different.
Yeah.
What's different than what you do and what would be in a gen ed ELA classroom. And I can ask you because you're doing both right now.
Yeah. There's sort of two answers to that. Answer one is like the persuasive or political response, which is that in reality, a majority of these approaches should be happening in tier one instruction, but unfortunately, they're not. And if they were, arguably, there would not be as much of a need for what I am doing in an intervention space. The reality is that's not happening in most classrooms because secondary teachers are not equipped with the training and skills. It's not for want. It's that is not their skill set. That's not what they're trained in. And there are most secondary teachers are not knowledgeable about the science of reading, and that has to change. So there's that.
Okay.
But the actual answer of what's happening are the little other bits and pieces. So just having students read short articles and then read a novel and doing comprehension strategies, that's not something that's unique to a literacy intervention. However, it's the intervention of those foundational skills. And so the dedicated space to working on decoding multisyllabic words and then to learning morphemes explicitly and reviewing them and practicing them, and then learning vocabulary words that have those morphemes in them and breaking them down. That typically, those are two interventions specifically in this class that do not happen in tier one and that are really high value add and evidence based. coaching around fluent reading doesn't happen in tier one spaces typically. And then the reversal of encoding. And I do this more with my middle school intervention classes, but we literally work on spelling patterns and spelling words, which spelling tests and kind of go away after elementary school in most English classes. Students aren't, expected to know how to spell words correctly, or they are, but they're not being explicitly taught those spelling rules or tested on them. And so that's something that happens in the intervention space to help support the gaps in phonics that they have. But I have to get kind of creative about it because with secondary struggling readers, not all of their struggles are the same, right? And some of them have larger gaps in their fluency, whereas others have larger gaps in their spelling, and then others, it's more in their comprehension and vocabulary. And so trying to hit at each of those pieces is like patchwork. And then which students can I pull for small groups that need support in this versus this? And then I think one of the biggest differences also is at the secondary level, even for English, right? The ultimate goal is this sounds counterintuitive, but it's not comprehension. It's applying the standard to their comprehension of the text. There is an assumption that they are already going to comprehend the text. So there's not a lot of concerted effort toward the actual comprehension. So, for example, in a high school English class, if they're supposed to be analyzing the theme of a novel while they're reading it, of a chapter of a book, then the questions and all of the practice and strategies and work that they're doing are going to be centered around what theme is being developed in the text and identifying textual evidence, not what is happening in the text, who's talking, what happened here, what happened next, was there a flashback, the actual like summary of what happened to make sure they understood and followed those ideas. And so the literacy intervention model is addressing that and giving them transferable strategies to use in order to understand what they're reading. So that then when they go into tier one classes and they're expected to just understand it, they're not given any supports for understanding it because they're expected to be doing the standard and applying the skill. Then they have that in their back pocket, that strategy that they can use on their own. Does that make sense?
Yes. So if I go into a classroom and let's say that a regular classroom and they're doing just what you said, identifying theme and looking for textual evidence to support that.
Hmm.
And the comprehension part is done by the teacher, which I think is very common that I've seen when teachers are, I'm doing air quotes, or, teaching a novel, that they will provide all the comprehension. And then the kids do, okay, identifying the theme and finding evidence based on that. So the teacher is isolating the variable with the assumption, isolating the variable of comprehension because they're just assuming they're not going to be able to do this. And or the teacher just loves to do that. That's because they love the novel and they want to talk about all of those things. So again, a clarifying question for me. If a teacher is doing that, are they robbing the kids of the opportunity to practice comprehension? Or help me out here. Is it if you saw a
Yeah.
teacher just continually do that and the kids don't have to read and try to comprehend themselves, would that be something we would want to wean a teacher off of? But only they could only do it if they had confidence in the kids could comprehend themselves.
Yeah. Man, Jean, that's a really good question because um, I don't think it ever comes from a place of malintent, right? From
Oh,
teachers. I
never. It
think
never does. It never does. They're
no,
working hard.
no. Right. Yeah, incredibly hard. Um, I do think that it unintentionally robs them of opportunities to practice those skills and to work on that. And I think that we have some learned patterns, right, in education that you mentioned at the start of this, it's that assumption of read to learn versus learn to read, right? Learn to read happens kindergarten through third grade, and really after that, or through second grade and beyond that, then it's the assumption is they already know how to read, and then they are reading to learn. And so they're gaining content and information, but that's a pretty broad assumption. And we're at a real crossroads in education. When you look at NAEP data, when you look at other, basically anything you look at would tell you that there is a reading crisis happening in our country, and that in droves, students are moving into these upper grades that do not have the foundation to read to learn, or that, yeah, so they don't have the foundation to do that. And that's going to require professional development for secondary teachers, and then a concerted effort, right? An acknowledgement on secondary teachers' parts to adjust their instruction to support comprehension more concertedly. And I think that's a hard one because our hands are tied as tier one teachers. You have a pacing guide, you have all of these standards you're trying to get through that for many teachers are reflected in state standardized tests. So you're like, well, I've got to get to theme. I've got to teach this skill. I've got to teach figurative language. So how am I going to go back and work on just making sure they actually understand what they're reading? And I would just say that at the end of the day, if they're not able to independently read and understand a complex grade level text on their own, then any of the other work is going to fall short for a majority of students in tier one classrooms. And so hopefully some of the strategies that I've shared today are fairly easy to implement, and they're not going to deviate significantly from your pacing guide to where all of a sudden you're not getting to your standards. It's really just a way of a shift in mindset, a paradigm shift a little bit in secondary education classrooms around the current state of reading in our country.
So peripherally, I follow, science of reading stuff and, the controversial topics and, that I don't have any deep understanding of. But, one of the things that I have read recently is the idea of not teaching comprehension skills. Now, here is my question. How much, and because you do teach reading comprehension, how much overlap is there between the ability to comprehend a text and the ability to read it fluently with prosody?
Super interconnected. So how we read it out loud is how we read in our heads. So that's like the first part. And so if a student or if a person cannot read fluently out loud and it's choppy, it's broken, there's no expression, then their brain signals, even if they're reading on their own, that voice in your head isn't signaling the right meaning. It's like if when you read a paragraph where there's no punctuation and it's just a massive run-on sentence, it's
Yeah.
hard to decipher the separate ideas. It's the same idea there. And so it's really poor comprehension is a byproduct of a lot of those other underlying issues, which is why when you're giving screeners, there's comprehension screeners, and then there's other screeners, and then diagnostics that you can give that reveal, right? You might flag a student on a screener for low comprehension, and then you have to give a diagnostic to say, okay, well, where actually are the gaps? Is it in there? And typically it's a fluency
Yeah.
issue. But then even with fluency, it's like, okay, but is it a prosody issue? Probably, but it's also an inability to decode multisyllabic. In the secondary space, it's
Yeah.
always like
Yeah.
decoding multisyllabic words and those tricky words with tricky spelling patterns. Yeah, so there is a direct correlation because of that cognitive load theory that says if you're spending all of your energy just trying to like get through a text and sound it out and being able to read it, and even if it's not super choppy and broken, but it's just at a slower rate, one, your working memory is like on overload
Yeah.
because it's taking you so long, it's slower, that it's harder for you to remember what you just read. The other part is that the cognitive load is so heavy on actually doing the reading that then there's no space left to be thinking about what it means. So we're striving for automaticity.
Well, when I think about the idea of a grade level text, one of the variables is, difficulty of vocabulary and that sort of thing, the complexity of just how it's written, the craft, involved. But the grade level part is that appropriate level books are understandable, they're comprehensible, not necessarily the reading, but the content, the ideas, the themes by students of that age.
Mhm.
which is what makes them appropriate. There are themes that you don't understand when you're 13 years old, but we don't
Mhm.
read those books because we want them to understand it and to be able to learn something from it. So, gosh, okay, Faith, you're going to have to come back. This is, this was terrific. I mean, there was so much, and I appreciate, I learned so much from this. I hope everybody does as well. But so, do you have any questions for me before we go?
Yeah, I mean, we've kind of touched on this like larger narrative, but because you are so plugged into education around our country and you've had countless conversations and interviews with really impactful people in the field, the thing I really am curious from your point of view is, are there any common themes or things that you tend to hear over and over in this like current dialogue about education or about reading? And then, yeah, how would you describe the current educational landscape related to reading? Is it one of hope, doom, or something else?
I think with respect to reading, one of the hopeful part is that everybody who's involved in education, not just within the system, but outside the system, which is the entire country, understands that reading is important, as opposed to math. There are a lot of people who do, well, I'm not good at math and I did fine. But reading, they understand that's a foundational skill. So that's hopeful. That's hopeful to me. Where I'm not so hopeful in the current situation is that you and I are in a silo. We're in the science of reading cult. We're in the science of learning cult. And you think because we're in that, it's just another one of the silos of the country where we think everybody knows this. Oh,
Mhm.
there's state law. No, you. So that's where I don't know in this country that we have so much freedom and we don't want to be told what to do. I don't know how it is in Wyoming, but even like I live in Fresno County in California, which
Yeah.
I think, the population of the entire county is about 1 million people. Okay. But I know you live in Wyoming, you're laughing.
Yeah.
Okay. But within that, in Fresno County, there are two large school districts and then there are 34 other school districts that the school board wants to be the boss. And I'm saying that in a non-judgmental way. I mean, that's why they were elected to oversee the education. So it's very difficult to get independent folks to say, okay, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. And the other thing is that I've been involved in education, gosh, since 1977. And
Wow.
since 1977, every time there's a new adoption, every time there's something new, oh, it's based on science. This is evidence based. This is evidence based. And I think we cried with the boy who cried wolf. Teachers are immune to that now.
Yeah.
And so, how do we get to those folks? So, I'm cautiously optimistic. I'm not supposed to use cliches on the show, but I'm
Yeah.
just because of that. How do we get the message out? And I think that one other thing is that I kept, and maybe you realize this as I was talking to you, because I work with intervention teachers and I work with general ed teachers, but it's very clear to me the better job that we can do in tier one, it's going to prevent a lot of this. And I can't keep piling on, excuse me, I can't keep piling on tier one teachers with another thing to do. I need to ask them to do something differently that's going to be more impactful. And I
Mm.
think that's what you did this entire episode is talk about some things that isn't more work. Let's do this instead of. But it still takes some professional development and some coaching, some assistance to be able to see, am I actually doing this? Because
Yeah.
I was talking to a teacher the other day. I loved what he said. He's just a science of learning nerd, science of reading nerd. And he's been sending me videos of his lessons. And you can see all these discrete things that he's doing. And and that all of these routines and procedures that he's done. And he says, but there's no coherent structure necessarily. And he goes, I know I'm doing Frankenstein teaching, just all of these little things that I'm grabbing.
Yeah.
And we can't do that. And I think we do that in our cult. It's like, oh, I'm going to do this. Like you talked about retrieval practice. It's easy to talk about, but there are some things that make it effective for the
Mhm.
amount of time that you spend. And you could spend the same amount of time doing it ineffectively. And you say, oh, that doesn't work. I'm not going to do that anymore. So I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and I think I think about your point that you made about people being willing, one, like educating folks that don't know about a lot of this. And then I think the concern with teachers feeling like here's another wave in education. If you wait around a couple years, it'll go away, and then there'll be
Yeah.
some other new snazzy name for this thing that we're all going to be required to do in the classroom, and then that'll go away, right? I've been teaching for 17 years, and I've definitely seen all of these like iterations of things come and go. So that idea about being immune to the next fad in education is real. But I just think back to like the core of teaching and why we got into this work. And it's like experimentation. I mean, that's why this class is called Lit Lab. It's not just because it's a laboratory for students to practice their literacy skills. It's honestly for me, it's a laboratory for me to experiment as action research with the most current models of what actually does move the needle. All right. And I'm not going off of a feeling. What's moving the needle for kids? And do we have data to prove that? And so I think as educators, like we have to be humble enough and willing enough to say the landscape of education has changed. I have to change with it, and I can't dig my heels in. And if we truly are lifelong learners, which is like most teachers just love learning and really like school, then we have to model that too of like, yeah, I have my curriculum really dialed in, but it's not working for me anymore. It's not serving my students the way that it used to 10 years ago. And that might mean that I need to spend some time incorporating some new strategies and new structures into what I'm doing to better serve these kids now that are in my room. And that's a hard pill to swallow. But I do believe in the science of reading, and it's not a fad because it's been around for 35, 40 years. It's just, it was not widely accessible or shared. And it's kind of sad that it's taken this long for that brain research to kind of reveal it, to come out in education. And it took something like COVID for a lot of people to wake up and
Yeah.
be like, oh, shoot, we need to do something.
Well,
But
in
yeah,
your intro, yeah.
I'm hopeful
Uh,
too.
yeah. So I just wanted to say, like in your introduction, mentioned that you were a Goyen fellow, and we didn't talk much about that. But what I do want to say is like you are in your lab, you are in your lab, and it's a laboratory for you. But part of being a Goyen fellow, is that you are videotaping what you're doing and sharing with the
Uh-huh.
world. So people
Yeah.
can go. So where can they go? I'll put in the show notes also, but where can they go to actually see you in action in your learning lab?
Yeah, the first place they can go, I have a teacher Facebook page called Literacy Lab with Faith. And then, yeah, and I have it linked for you. And then I have a Substack as well called Lit Lab with Faith, where there are video clips and then blog posts shared. And then the Science of Reading Classroom has a YouTube channel where videos of other Goyen fellows, but then also videos that I share come out. And then I have a email, Literacy Lab with Faith, if anybody ever wants to talk a little bit more.
All right. And so people can actually see you do these things because we didn't get to talk about everything, but everything we talked about, they can see you do.
Yes,
It's
I'm
there.
really
Okay.
passionate about this stuff.
Yeah.
So I want people to see this and then feel empowered to try it and see the impact that it can have on their students too.
Well, here's something else that I know, Faith, is you're from Wyoming. You're on, as we mentioned in the introduction, you're on the board of the literacy. Oh shoot,
Yeah,
the
Reading
reading,
League
yeah,
Wyoming. Yeah.
the Reading League Wyoming. But you want to be sure that folks listening to this in Wyoming are up to date on what's happening in the legislature. What was there's a bill you wanted to talk about.
Yeah, right now our joint education committee is going to be meeting next week in our state, specifically discussing passing a K through 12 reading bill, which would require higher levels of accountability on educators and schools, both in identifying and supporting struggling readers. And so, if anybody's listening that is from Wyoming, contact your local legislators and advocate for this because, again, these are folks that might not be super familiar with and what that looks like in schools. And for them to hear from teachers directly, it's really powerful in like what the challenges that we're facing, even in the secondary space with struggling adolescent readers.
Faith, thank you so much for this. I know people are going to get a lot out of it, and not only this podcast, but again, being able to see you in action as part of being a Goyen Fellow. So thank you so
Thank you,
much.
Jean. Really appreciate you having me here.
If you're enjoying these podcasts, tell a friend. Also, please leave a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. You can follow me on Blue Sky at G Tavernetti, on Twitter, X, at G Tavernetti, and you can learn more about me and the work I do at my website, tesscg.com. That's TESSCG.com, where you will also find information about ordering my books, Teach Fast, Focused Adaptable Structured Teaching, and maximizing the impact of coaching cycles.